A single father spent his last pennies on an abandoned cabin in the mountains. Everyone laughed at his desperate decision, convinced he had ruined both his and his daughter's life. But no one could have imagined what his little girl would find inside this house, and how it would change their lives forever. Subscribe to the channel and tell us in the comments where you're watching from. Michael had never imagined his life could collapse so quickly. Only a year ago, he had been a respected engineer at a small construction firm. A man who came home in the evenings to the smell of his wife's cooking and the laughter of their 8-year-old daughter, Lily. The house they lived in was modest, but it was theirs, filled with books, drawings taped to the refrigerator, and the sound of piano practice echoing from the living room. All of that ended with a single accident on a rain-slick highway that took his wife's life and left him grasping for air in a world that suddenly felt hostile and alien. The grief hollowed him out, and the weight of responsibility pressed down heavier each passing day. He tried to keep working, but concentration faltered, deadlines slipped, and eventually the company let him go. Bills piled up. The savings he thought would last vanished within months. Friends stopped calling, awkward in the face of his sorrow. Even his own family, scattered across other states, offered only distant words of sympathy, but no real support. Soon, Michael and Lily were forced out of their home, their possessions reduced to what could be packed into the back of an aging sedan. They bounced between cheap motels and rented rooms, places where the walls were thin, the carpets stained, and the smell of disinfectant hung in the air, like a reminder of other lives that had passed through in quiet desperation. Lily clung to him with a kind of fierce resilience no child should have had to learn. She never complained, though Michael caught her watching other children with their parents in parks and cafes, her eyes full of questions she didn't dare ask. The breaking point came one morning as Michael sat at the small plastic desk in their motel room, going through a stack of overdue bills. He had less than $200 left, no job, and no clear plan. The weight of failure pressed down on him until he could barely breathe. Lily was drawing on scraps of paper nearby, humming softly to herself. It was then, in that fragile moment between despair and collapse, that he saw a notice in the local newspaper. A county property auction was scheduled for the following weekend. Most of the listings were beyond his reach: suburban homes, small businesses, parcels of farmland, but one item caught his eye. A mountain cabin, structure in disrepair, 5 acres of woodland on the edge of the county. The opening bid was listed as $50, but there was a note about possible reductions for lack of interest. Michael stared at the listing, his pulse quickening. The rational part of his mind dismissed it immediately. A ruined cabin in the mountains was hardly a solution to their problems. It would have no electricity, no plumbing, no comforts. It might not even be safe. And yet something about it stirred a glimmer of hope. It represented ownership, permanence, a place that couldn't be taken away by a landlord or a late payment notice. It represented, however fragile, a chance to rebuild. The following Saturday, he drove with Lily to the county courthouse lawn where the auction was held. The day was warm, with a breeze carrying the smell of fresh-cut grass. Folding chairs had been arranged beneath a white tent, and clusters of people stood with clipboards and coffee cups, murmuring to each other in the bright sunlight. Most were investors, sharp-eyed men and women looking to scoop up foreclosed houses or farmland at bargain prices. Michael felt out of place in his worn jacket and tired shoes, clutching the thin wallet that held the last of their savings. The auctioneer began with a booming voice, announcing each property and calling out bids. Prices soared far beyond anything Michael could afford, each sale greeted with nods and satisfied smiles from the winners. He sat silently beside Lily, watching the numbers climb, his stomach tightening with each property lost. He thought of leaving, of sparing himself the humiliation of being the poorest man in a crowd of wealth. But something rooted him to his chair, a stubborn determination not to give up before the cabin appeared on the list. When the auctioneer finally reached the item, he almost seemed embarrassed. Lot 14, mountain cabin, Blackwood Ridge, 5 acres, structure in severe disrepair, no utilities, opening bid, $500. His voice rang out, but the crowd was silent. No one moved. The auctioneer frowned and repeated the bid. Still nothing. He dropped it to 200, then 100. People chuckled, shaking their heads. $50? He tried, the tone of desperation creeping in. Michael felt his pulse hammering. He had just over $70 to his name, and spending it on this was madness. Yet the silence of the crowd, the way no one else cared, made something inside him snap. He raised his hand, his voice rough from nerves. 50 cents, he said. The crowd erupted in laughter. A man in an expensive suit leaned to his companion and whispered something, both of them smirking. The auctioneer squinted, clearly thinking Michael was making a joke. Sir, this is a legal auction, he said. We can't. But then after a hurried consultation with a county official, he sighed. No other bids. Very well. Sold to the gentleman for 50 cents. Michael felt a dizzying rush of shame and defiance as he stepped forward, pressing 2 quarters into the clerk's hand. The man in the suit approached him, his smile sharp. You do realize you just bought a worthless pile of timber? That cabin hasn't been lived in for decades. You'd be better off sleeping in your car. Michael met his gaze steadily, though his insides quaked. Sometimes the only thing to do, he said quietly, is bet everything on nothing at all. He turned away before the man could answer, taking Lily's hand and walking back to their car. She looked up at him with wide, questioning eyes. Are we really going to live in a cabin in the mountains? He didn't answer immediately, tucking the deed into his pocket as if it were a talisman. Finally, he squeezed her hand. Yes, we are. The drive to Blackwood Ridge took most of the afternoon. At first, the roads wound through suburbs and small towns, but soon they narrowed into rougher lanes lined with thickening trees. Civilization fell away, mile by mile, until even the scattered farmhouses disappeared. The final stretch was a rutted dirt road, the car bouncing and groaning as if protesting each turn. Michael gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying not to think of the wisdom of what he was doing. The GPS had lost its signal, and he was navigating by a crude map the county clerk had drawn on the back of the deed. Turn left at the lightning-struck pine, the clerk had written, and sure enough, a blackened, twisted tree marked the way. Lily pressed her face to the window, silent now, her earlier excitement fading into nervousness. The motel they had left behind had at least offered electricity and running water. Here there was nothing but endless forest, the shadows deepening as the sun sank lower. Finally, the track curved around a massive boulder, and the cabin came into view. Michael's heart sank. Cabin was too generous a word for the sagging structure before them. The roof dipped like the spine of an old horse, windows boarded up, porch leaning dangerously to one side. Weeds grew waist-high around the foundation, and a rusted padlock secured the front door. Lily's voice was carefully neutral as she murmured, "Home, sweet home." He forced a smile, not letting her see his doubt. "It's a fixer-upper," he said, "but it's ours. No rent, no mortgage, just a place to catch our breath." He parked the car and they got out, crunching over fallen branches toward the door. The padlock gave way to the iron key with a screech of rust, and the smell of must and abandonment wafted out. Dust danced in the beams of sunlight as Michael pushed the door open, revealing a main room with a stone fireplace, a small back bedroom, and a ladder leading to a loft. The floor creaked but held. The roof was stained with leaks, but the beams were solid, hand-hewn by someone long ago who had cared enough to build with skill. For a moment standing there in the dim light, Michael felt something shift inside him. It was madness, yes, but it was also possibility. This broken-down cabin in the middle of nowhere was theirs, and for the first time in months, he allowed himself to imagine a future that wasn't dictated by eviction notices and empty wallets. He looked at Lily, who sneezed in the dust but then grinned as she spotted shelves built into the wall. "We'll need to fix the roof," he said, his voice firm with decision, "and the windows. But this can work." Outside, the forest rustled, indifferent to their arrival. The sun dipped below the ridge, casting long shadows across the clearing. Michael pulled the door closed and leaned against it, exhausted but strangely calm. They had reached the end of the road in every sense of the word. This was their last chance. Whether it became a failure or a new beginning would depend on what they did next. The night they first arrived, the cabin seemed to hold its breath around them. The air inside was heavy with decades of dust and mildew. The smell of wood gone soft with moisture, of stone walls that had trapped damp air through countless winters. Michael stood just inside the doorway, his hand still on the rusted iron key, and listened to the groan of the floorboards beneath his boots. Lily clung to his sleeve, her eyes darting around the shadowy corners where the fading light could not reach. He could sense her hesitation, though she tried not to show it. She had learned too quickly in these past months to keep her fears hidden, as if afraid of burdening him with more than he already carried. He set down the small duffel bag they had brought from the car and stepped farther into the main room. It was larger than it had appeared from the outside, dominated by a rough stone fireplace on one wall. Dust floated in the beams of light that spilled through gaps in the boarded windows. A wooden table sat shoved into one corner, its surface scarred with knife marks and old stains. Beside it, two chairs, one missing a leg and propped against the wall at a helpless angle. The place had clearly not been touched in decades, yet for all its decay, there was an integrity to the structure that filled him with a cautious kind of hope. He walked slowly from room to room, testing each step, noting where the boards sagged and where the roof had leaked. The bedroom was little more than a narrow space with shelves built into the wall and a small window facing the eastern ridge. The ladder in the corner led to a loft, though he did not yet trust it enough to climb. He could feel the presence of the past here, the marks of hands that had built and shaped it long ago. Lily crept after him, her sneakers scuffing the dirty floor. She ran her fingers along the wooden shelves in the bedroom, leaving trails through the dust. "It looks like a dollhouse that someone forgot," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. Michael forced himself to smile. "Then we'll remind it what it's for." He wanted his voice to sound confident, but it came out rough, tired. He knew this was madness. They had no real tools, no money for lumber or shingles, barely enough food to last a few days. And yet, as he looked at his daughter standing small and pale in the fading light, he felt a stubborn determination flare within him. This was their home now, for better or worse. They would make it work. The first task was air. He pried loose the boards from the nearest window, each plank brittle with rot, and sunlight spilled in with a rush of warmth. Dust swirled into golden patterns. Lily sneezed, then laughed at the sound echoing strangely off the bare walls. They moved together from window to window, tugging away boards until the cabin was filled with light, and the forest outside became visible again. Through the now clear panes, Michael could see the slope of the ridge, the dark pines crowding close, and beyond them the sky beginning to turn pink with sunset. With light came the realization of how much work awaited them. The floor was covered in a thick layer of dirt and debris leaves blown in through cracks, rodent droppings, splinters of wood. Michael fetched the small broom from the car, its bristles already worn, and handed it to Lily. She swept with surprising seriousness, gathering dust into piles while he carried out broken bits of furniture and wood. Every motion seemed symbolic, a way of claiming this place not just as shelter, but as something more enduring. Sweat ran down his back, his muscles ached, but as the room slowly cleared, he felt a small flicker of pride. As dusk fell, he lit the battery-powered lantern they had brought from the motel. Its pale glow revealed walls lined with handmade shelves, a dry sink in the corner of the kitchen area, hooks hammered into beams for hanging tools or clothing. These small details made the place feel less like an abandoned ruin and more like a home waiting to be reclaimed. Lily, tired from sweeping, curled up on her sleeping bag in the middle of the main room. She clutched the small stuffed rabbit she had carried since her mother's death, its fur worn thin. Michael sat beside her, the lantern casting their shadows long across the walls. He opened his worn notebook and began to write a list, his mind settling into the discipline of tasks: roof repair, water source, chimney inspection, food supply, window sealing. He wrote each item with care, as if putting the problems into words could give him power over them. For the first time in months, he felt the stirring of a plan, a sense of purpose beyond mere survival. He closed the notebook, slipped it back into his pocket, and lay down beside his daughter. The floor was hard, the air cold, but exhaustion wrapped him quickly in sleep. The morning light woke him early. It filtered through the uncovered windows, casting patterns across the floor. Michael rose quietly, careful not to disturb Lily, and stepped outside. The air was crisp, sharper than he was used to, filled with the scent of pine and earth. He stood on the sagging porch, surveying the small clearing around the cabin. Weeds grew tall and tangled, and a path led away toward the forest, half swallowed by undergrowth. Birds called from the trees, and in the distance he could hear the faint rush of water. That sound gave him hope. A creek nearby would mean survival if it proved clean. When Lily woke, she padded barefoot across the dusty floor to the door, her hair sticking out in wild tangles. She looked at the forest with wide eyes, then at him. "It's really ours," she said. Her voice was hushed, full of wonder. Michael nodded. "Yes, ours." They ate a breakfast of oatmeal cooked on the small camp stove, the taste bland but warm. Afterward, he led her outside to explore the immediate surroundings. Behind the cabin, the land sloped downward, and within a short walk they found a narrow creek running over smooth stones, the water clear and cold. Michael knelt, cupping his hands to drink, then stopped himself. His mind, trained by years of engineering, knew better. Untested water was dangerous. He filled an empty bottle instead, making a mental note to boil and test it before letting Lily drink. Returning to the cabin, he began to assess the damage more carefully. The roof was the most urgent. From the ground he could see shingles missing, others warped or crumbling. Rain would soon find its way through every weakness. He circled the structure, noting gaps in the walls where wind whistled through, broken steps on the porch, places where the foundations sagged. Each flaw felt like a challenge thrown in his path, but he refused to be daunted. Lily followed him with curiosity, asking questions he answered as best he could. Why was the roof bent? Because the beams had softened with time. Why were the windows covered? To keep out intruders or animals, perhaps. Why did the cabin stand empty for so long? He didn't have an answer for that one, though he promised her they would find out. She listened intently, as if the cabin itself were a puzzle they had to solve together. By afternoon, they returned to cleaning inside. They dragged broken boards to a pile outside, swept again until the air was clearer, and arranged the table and one usable chair near the fireplace. Michael examined the chimney, running his hands along the rough stones. It seemed intact, but he would need to climb onto the roof to be certain it wasn't blocked. That task would wait. For now, they needed to make the place livable. The hours passed in a rhythm of small labors. Lily took to her role with a seriousness that touched him. She carried armfuls of twigs to feed the camp stove, sorted through piles of wood for pieces that might be useful, even tried to mend the broken chair with a piece of string. Each act of participation seemed to strengthen her sense of belonging. By the time the sun dipped toward the trees, the cabin looked less like a ruin and more like the beginning of a home. That evening, as they unrolled their sleeping bags once more, Michael felt the first glimmer of peace he had known in months. He watched Lily trace her finger over the carved initials in the window frame, letters he hadn't noticed before, worn by time but still legible. Someone else had lived here long ago, someone who had marked this place as their own. For Michael, that thought was strangely comforting. They were not the first to seek refuge in these mountains, and perhaps they would not be the last. As darkness fell, the sounds of the forest grew louder. An owl called, crickets chirped, branches creaked in the wind. Lily pressed closer to him, her small body warm against his side. He wrapped an arm around her and stared into the shadows, his mind turning over the endless tasks that lay ahead. It would not be easy. It might not even be possible, but it was theirs, this fragile chance carved from ruin. He closed his eyes, whispering a silent promise to himself and to his daughter. They would not give up, not here, not now. When sleep came, it was deep and dreamless, and for the first time in a long while, Michael felt he had stepped not into the end of his story, but into the uncertain beginning of a new one. The next morning arrived with a clarity Michael had not felt in years. He woke to a silence that was not silence at all, but rather a chorus of sounds so natural that his ears at first did not know how to process them. The gentle rush of the creek in the distance, the wind threading through the pines, birds calling from the canopy, and somewhere far off, the lonely cry of a hawk echoed over the ridge. He turned on his side and saw Lily still asleep, curled tightly in her sleeping bag with her stuffed rabbit pressed beneath her chin. She looked peaceful, and for a moment he simply allowed himself to breathe, to take in the strangeness of their new life, to believe that perhaps here, in this forgotten cabin, they might begin again. But the illusions of peace were fragile, and as soon as he rose and stepped outside into the morning light, the reality of their situation pressed down on him. The cabin was a skeleton, fragile and weary from years of abandonment. The porch leaned more precariously than it had seemed in the dim light the night before. The roof sagged ominously, and the weeds around the property stood as tall as Lily. His mental list of tasks returned with brutal weight. The roof had to be addressed before rain destroyed the interior. Water had to be secured and tested. Heat had to be made reliable, and food supplies had to be stretched far beyond their current limits. It was a hierarchy of needs as old as human survival. Shelter, water, fire, food. Everything else was a luxury they no longer had the privilege to consider. Inside, Lily woke slowly, rubbing her eyes, her hair a wild halo around her face. She smiled at him as he re-entered, and he marveled again at her resilience. She had endured the loss of her mother, the indignities of motels and temporary housing, the fear that lurked behind every move. And yet she could still smile at him with a trust that pierced his heart. "Breakfast?" she asked hopefully. He nodded, unpacking the small camp stove and their meager supplies. Oatmeal again, with a few dried raisins sprinkled in. It was not much, but it was warm, and the look of satisfaction on her face as she ate was enough to push away his gnawing worry, if only for a little while. Afterward, he took her hand and led her outside. The sun was higher now, burning away the morning mist. They walked to the creek together, Michael carrying the bottles they had scavenged from their old life. The water ran clear, tumbling over stones polished smooth with centuries of flow. Lily bent down, her reflection trembling on the surface, and reached out to touch it. "It looks clean," she said. Michael nodded but kept his caution. He knew better than to drink without testing, though they had neither lab equipment nor modern filters. Still, boiling would suffice for now, and his old knowledge of chemistry whispered to him about ways to fashion makeshift filters with sand, charcoal, and cloth. They would manage. They had to. Back at the cabin, he faced the looming roof. The shingles were brittle, many rotted through entirely. He dragged their only ladder from the storage shed out back, its rungs cracked but usable, and leaned it against the porch roof. Carefully he climbed, feeling the structure tremble beneath his weight. Lily stood below, her face turned up, worry plain in her eyes. "Be careful, Daddy," she called. He forced a grin down at her. "Always." Up on the roof, the damage was worse than he had feared. Whole sections were soft to the touch, crumbling under his fingers. He tore away the worst of it, tossing rotted boards to the ground, and made note of where a temporary tarp might shield them from rain until he could find proper materials. It was grueling work, the sun beating down, sweat dripping into his eyes, but he pressed on. Lily tried to help in her own way. She gathered fallen branches, arranged tools he had left scattered, even attempted to climb the ladder until he firmly told her to stay below. Her persistence made him proud, though it also frightened him. She was still so small, yet she seemed determined to shoulder responsibility beyond her years. He saw her watching him intently, studying every movement, and he realized with a pang that she was learning survival, not from books or schools, but from his example here, on this fragile roof in the middle of the wilderness. The day wore on, and exhaustion began to creep into his limbs. When he finally descended from the roof, his shirt soaked through with sweat, he saw that Lily had been busy sweeping the porch clean of leaves and dirt. She looked up at him, her cheeks flushed, and asked with a seriousness that startled him, "Is it enough, Daddy? Are we safe now?" He crouched before her, brushing hair from her forehead. "It's a start," he said. "It's never enough all at once. But we'll keep going." That night, as the sun bled away behind the trees and darkness filled the clearing, they sat together by the camp stove, eating canned beans warmed in a dented pot. The forest came alive around them with the sounds of night. Crickets chirped, owls hooted, and once far away, the low howl of a wolf rolled through the valley. Lily stiffened at the sound, clutching her rabbit tighter. Michael rested a hand on her shoulder. "They're out there, but we're in here," he told her gently. "This is our home now. We'll keep it strong." She nodded, but her wide eyes betrayed her fear. Sleep was harder to come by that night. The forest's noises seemed louder, and the shadows deeper. Michael lay awake, staring at the ceiling where faint moonlight filtered through cracks. He listened to Lily's breathing, steady and soft, and forced himself to focus on practical thoughts. Tomorrow he would fashion a better water filter. Tomorrow he would reinforce the porch steps. Tomorrow he would begin clearing land for a small garden, though it was late in the season. The list was endless, and though fear pressed in on him, so too did a quiet determination. The following morning brought a new challenge. Lily coughed as she woke, her face pale. Panic surged in Michael's chest. He pressed a hand to her forehead, fearing fever, but found it cool. Likely just the chill of the damp cabin, but it was a warning. Their living conditions were fragile, and even a small illness could tip the balance. He wrapped her in a blanket, brewed water boiled from the creek, and coaxed her to sip slowly. She gave him a tired smile, and he felt his heart ache with the weight of his responsibility. He could not fail her. Not here, not now. That day, while she rested, he explored the edges of the property. He discovered a small outbuilding leaning drunkenly against the trees, its roof half collapsed. Inside, he found rusted tools, a coil of rope, and a stack of old boards weathered but still strong enough to be useful. He carried them back piece by piece, already planning how to shore up the cabin's weakest points. By the time he returned, Lily was sitting on the porch steps, her blanket wrapped around her shoulders, watching the forest with wide, thoughtful eyes. "Daddy," she said softly, "do you think someone used to love this place?" The question caught him off guard. He looked at the cabin, at its hand-hewn beams and careful joinery, at the shelves built into the walls, and he realized she was right. This was not the work of indifference. Whoever had lived here once had cared enough to build with skill and patience. "Yes," he answered finally. "I think they did." That evening, as they prepared to settle in again, Lily explored the back bedroom while he arranged supplies. When she called for him, her voice held a mixture of excitement and fear. He hurried to her side and found her pointing at the wall beneath the window. Scratched into the wood were faint letters, initials worn by time but still visible. She traced them with her finger. "Someone left their mark," she whispered. Beneath the letters lay a small crack in the wall. Curious, Michael pried at it with his pocket knife, and after a moment a folded scrap of yellowed paper fell free. It was fragile. The ink faded, but legible. He unfolded it carefully and read the words written there. A fragment of thought, perhaps a note left by the previous occupant. "The woods hold more than they reveal. Remember to look beneath what is broken." He frowned, puzzled, but slipped it into his notebook. The discovery unsettled him, yet it also added a strange sense of continuity, as if the cabin itself were reaching out across time. That night, as Lily slept with the note tucked beside her stuffed rabbit like a secret treasure, Michael sat by the dying glow of the stove and wrote in his notebook. Roof, temporary repairs done. Water, boiling works, filter needed. Food, limited. Fireplace, inspection still required. Strange note found. Initials in window frame. He paused, staring at the words. The challenges seemed insurmountable, yet he felt the faintest flicker of something he had not known in months. Not just survival, not just endurance, but the possibility of belonging, of making this broken cabin into a place where they might not just exist but truly live. As the fire dwindled and the night deepened, Michael closed the notebook and lay back on his sleeping bag. The forest murmured beyond the walls, a reminder of dangers still to come. Yet as he drifted towards sleep, one thought anchored him. They had begun. Against all odds, they had taken their first real steps toward building a home. The days that followed settled into a rhythm, though the rhythm was one of constant labor. Michael rose with the sun each morning, his mind already churning with the long list of tasks that seemed to stretch endlessly before him. He patched holes in the roof with the salvaged boards he had dragged from the leaning outbuilding, and though his work was crude and slow, each nailed plank gave him the sense that the cabin was breathing easier. Lily swept the floor again and again until the air was less thick with dust, and she learned to arrange kindling in the stove so that their small fires caught quicker. They were no longer strangers in the ruin. They were slowly becoming its inhabitants. Yet always at the back of Michael's mind, there was the scrap of paper they had found hidden in the bedroom wall, its words haunting him with quiet insistence. The woods hold more than they reveal. Remember to look beneath what is broken. He could not shake the feeling that the message was meant for someone who would come after, perhaps for him and Lily, though that thought bordered on madness. When Lily asked him about it, her eyes shining with curiosity, he told her only that it was probably an old reminder to the cabin's builder, some piece of wisdom about life in the mountains. But she was not fooled. She carried the note with her, tucked inside her rabbit's cloth body, and sometimes he caught her whispering the words under her breath as though they were part of a spell. One afternoon, while clearing a pile of broken boards from the corner of the main room, Michael uncovered a loose floorboard. At first he thought nothing of it, but when he pressed down with his boot, it shifted slightly, groaning against the nails that had held it once. He knelt, pried it up with his knife, and found a hollow space beneath. Dust billowed into his face, stinging his eyes, but when it cleared, he saw the outline of a small tin box wedged against the beam. His breath caught. Carefully, he lifted it free and brought it into the light. The lid was rusted but not sealed, and with a sharp twist of his wrist, it gave way. Inside lay a collection of oddments: a pocket knife dulled by use, a compass with a cracked glass face, several folded sheets of paper so brittle he feared they would crumble in his hands. Lily was at his side in an instant, her small fingers hovering over the box as though she had stumbled upon buried treasure. Together they unfolded the papers, smoothing them gently across the table. Some were nothing more than old receipts and grocery lists, the ink faded to ghostly smudges. But one sheet stood out, covered in neat handwriting that had survived the years. It was a journal entry, perhaps, or a letter never sent. October 12th, 1966. The mountain watches but does not speak. I came here to escape what could not be changed, to build something of my own from what the world casts aside. Yet even here, the past claws at me. I have hidden what I could, though I wonder if anyone will ever come looking. If they do, I pray they are not like the men I fled, who would strip the earth for its veins and leave only scars behind. To whomever finds this place, remember, the land gives, but it also remembers. Take only what you need, or it will take from you in return. Michael read the words aloud in a low voice, the sound filling the cabin with an eerie weight. Lily listened with wide eyes, hugging her rabbit close. He was hiding, she whispered when he finished. But from who? Michael did not answer immediately. He folded the paper again, set it back in the tin, and closed the lid. His mind raced with possibilities. Perhaps the man who had built this cabin had been nothing more than a hermit, a recluse escaping debts or heartbreak. Or perhaps it was something darker, a flight from those who would harm him, from secrets buried not just in the earth, but in his soul. That night, long after Lily had fallen asleep, Michael sat by the glow of the lantern and read the note again. The words stirred something in him, a kinship he had not expected. He too had fled, though not from faceless men, but from grief, from failure, from a world that no longer seemed to have a place for him. The cabin was not just a shelter for his body, but a reflection of his heart, broken yet standing, scarred yet stubborn. Perhaps that was why the message felt less like a relic of the past and more like a quiet command to carry forward. The next morning, Lily insisted they explore the woods behind the cabin. Michael agreed, both to indulge her excitement and to see what the land offered. They followed the creek upstream, the air damp with the scent of moss and earth. The forest was dense, but here and there, traces of human presence lingered, a half-collapsed fence swallowed by vines, the remnants of a fire pit near the bank, stones blackened with old soot. Lily darted ahead, her laughter ringing between the trees, and for a moment Michael allowed himself to imagine that this was not survival but adventure, a father and daughter discovering the world anew. Then Lily stumbled upon something half-buried near the roots of a fallen oak. She called for him, and when he reached her, he saw the corner of a wooden crate jutting from the soil. Together they dug with their hands until the box came free, its boards swollen with rot. Inside were more papers, carefully wrapped in oilcloth, and a small, leather-bound notebook. The sight of it made Michael's skin prickle. He wiped away dirt and opened the cover. Inside, in bold letters, were the initials TS. He flipped through the pages, scanning diagrams of rock formations, notes about mineral veins, sketches of the surrounding ridges. It was the work of a geologist, detailed and precise, but interspersed with the scientific observations were paragraphs that drifted into something more personal. They came again today, pressing me to sell what I know. They do not care what their mines will do to the water, to the forest, to those who live in its shadow. They see only silver, only profit. I cannot let them have it. Better the mountains keep their secrets than be torn apart by greed. Michael felt a chill as he read. This was no mere hermit. Whoever T.S. was, he had discovered something valuable in these mountains, something that others had wanted badly enough to pursue, and he had chosen to hide it here, to leave behind warnings instead of claims. Michael closed the book and looked at Lily, who was staring at him with a mixture of awe and fear. "It's like a storybook," she whispered, "but real." They carried the notebook back to the cabin, their footsteps quickening as though the forest itself were listening. Inside, Michael spread the contents across the table, the pages filled with maps and notes. His hands trembled as he traced the lines, the coordinates, the sketches of silver veins running through stone. This was no myth. T.S. had found something real, something that could change lives. But the warnings were just as real. The greed of others, the scars left behind, the conviction that the land must be protected. That night, Michael lay awake staring at the ceiling. The cabin creaked with the wind. The forest whispered outside, and Lily slept beside him, clutching the stuffed rabbit with the hidden note still tucked inside. His mind whirled with questions. Who was T.S.? What had become of him? And why did it feel as though fate had led Michael and Lily here to pick up a thread left dangling decades ago? He thought of the words written in the journal. The land gives, but it also remembers. He thought of the secret silver veins mapped in careful detail. And he thought of his daughter, who deserved more than this fragile existence, who deserved a future bright with possibility. Yet possibility was always shadowed by danger. He knew enough of the world to realize that if these discoveries were real, others might still be searching. Others who would not care about the warnings. Others who would see only wealth waiting to be extracted. The cabin, once simply a desperate refuge, had now become a threshold into something much larger, something that could either save them or destroy them. As the fire in the stove burned low and the cabin sank into darkness, Michael made a silent vow. He would uncover the truth of this place, of the man who had lived here before, of the secrets buried in the ridges and streams. But he would do so with caution, with reverence, with the determination to protect rather than exploit. For in the end, the cabin was more than a structure. It was a story half told, a mystery waiting to be finished. And somehow, against all odds, it had chosen him and Lily to carry it forward. The forest had begun to change by the time Michael and Lily discovered the journal of T.S. The green that had seemed endless in summer now carried tinges of rust and gold, and the air was sharper when the sun dipped behind the ridge. Each morning, Michael awoke with a deeper awareness that time was moving against them. The journal sat on the table most nights as he tried to piece together its meanings, but during the day, the work of survival demanded his body. He rose early, cut wood, dragged branches, patched what he could with salvaged scraps. The cabin grew sturdier, but his hands bled and his shoulders ached with the effort. Lily helped as best she could, gathering twigs and keeping the fire alive. But she was still a child, and Michael found himself praying silently each night that her small body would withstand the cold that was surely coming. The sense of urgency sharpened one morning when frost coated the grass outside the cabin. Lily pressed her nose against the window, fascinated by the glittering crystals, while Michael stared with a sick knot in his stomach. Frost meant winter was almost here, and winter meant isolation. Snow that could cut them off for weeks, nights so long and cold that a weak fire might falter and fail. He remembered the way his mother used to describe winters in her childhood, how the old farmhouse creaked under the weight of snow, how pipes froze, how livestock perished when the storm stretched too long. And here, in this broken cabin with no plumbing, no insulation, no modern protections, he realized they stood at the edge of real danger. That day he doubled his pace. He hauled logs until his arms shook, then forced himself to split them until blisters tore. He showed Lily how to stack the wood in neat rows beneath a tarp so that it would stay dry. She worked with quiet determination, her small hands clumsy but eager. When the pile reached shoulder height, she grinned at him with a pride that pierced his chest. He kissed her forehead, hiding the fear that their pile, though large, would never be enough. It was during these long hours of labor that Lily's laughter began to fade. She grew quieter, coughing sometimes in the mornings when the air was damp. Michael noticed the dark shadows beneath her eyes and the way she curled closer to the fire at night. He told himself it was only the chill, but the worry gnawed at him. One evening after she had fallen asleep, he pressed his hand against her forehead and felt a faint warmth. Panic clawed at him. He rummaged through the few supplies they had, finding only the small bottle of children's medicine he had bought weeks ago. He gave her a measured dose, then sat awake beside her, listening to her breathing until dawn. By morning her fever had not worsened, but neither had it vanished. Michael felt the weight of his decisions crash down on him. He had dragged his daughter into the wilderness with nothing but a gamble on an old cabin, and now she lay sick with no doctor for miles. He cursed himself silently, swore that he would never forgive himself if she slipped beyond his reach. Yet when Lily opened her eyes and smiled weakly at him, whispering that she was all right, he forced a smile in return and told her she was brave, stronger than anyone he knew. The crisis steeled his resolve. He hiked into the woods that day with the Journal of Tease in his pack, following the notes about herbs and plants scribbled in the margins. The geologist had apparently learned from local lore or his own studies, listing plants that grew along the ridges and their medicinal properties. Michael hunted until he found a patch of yarrow, bitter-smelling and coarse, and carried it back to brew into a tea. Lily gagged on the taste but drank it for his sake, and though it was no miracle, her cough eased and her fever lessened. For the first time, Michael felt that the ghost of the man who had lived here before might be guiding them still. Yet their trials were not limited to illness and weather. One afternoon, while Michael was reinforcing the roof with scavenged boards, he heard the low rumble of voices. At first he thought it was an echo from the woods, but then Lily rushed in from outside, her face pale. "There are men," she whispered. Michael grabbed the hatchet from beside the door and stepped onto the porch. Two men stood at the edge of the clearing. They were dressed in hunting gear, rifles slung over their shoulders, their faces ruddy from the cold. One spat into the weeds while the other grinned. "Well, well," the grinning one said. "Didn't think anyone was dumb enough to try living in this old wreck." His voice carried a mocking edge that twisted Michael's stomach. Michael forced his voice steady. "We're doing fine here." The men exchanged a glance, then laughed. "Sure you are," the other said. "Cabin's been called a coffin on stilts since before I was born. Folks wagered how long it would take anyone to give up on it. Guess we just won." Michael gripped the hatchet tighter but kept it low at his side. He wanted to tell them to leave, to scream that they had no right to stand there sneering at what he and Lily had fought to build. But the sight of the rifles slung casually on their shoulders restrained him. "We're not going anywhere," he said instead, his voice low. The men chuckled again, then turned as if bored. One called back over his shoulder, "Don't freeze too quick. Wouldn't want to miss the show." Then they disappeared into the trees. When Michael went back inside, his hands trembled so badly he could barely set down the hatchet. Lily clung to him, and he realized she had heard every word. He tried to reassure her, telling her they were strong, that no one could scare them from their home. But inside he felt the sting of humiliation and fear. The men's laughter echoed in his mind, their words confirming the doubts that haunted him in the quiet hours of night. What if he was condemning his daughter to failure, to suffering, to a slow collapse in the mountains? The Journal of T.S. seemed to answer him when he opened it again that evening. The words written decades before might as well have been addressed to him directly. They will laugh, they will call you a fool. They measure worth in coin and convenience, not in courage or conviction. Let them laugh. The mountain does not laugh. The mountain remembers. Reading those lines, Michael felt a heat rise in his chest. He decided then that he would not be broken by strangers' mockery. Every nail he hammered, every log he split, every drop of medicine he coaxed from the land was proof that he and Lily were building something stronger than ridicule. The following days tested that resolve. A storm swept down from the peaks, fierce wind driving sheets of rain that turned the clearing into a mire. The roof shuddered under the onslaught, water seeping through cracks Michael had not yet patched. He scrambled across the shingles, the storm battering him as Lily held a lantern inside and called up encouragement. By the time he finished, he was soaked to the bone, but the leaks had slowed and the fire still burned. They spent that night huddled close, listening to the storm's fury, knowing they had survived one more trial. But winter was not waiting politely at the door. It was pressing in. The nights grew colder, the creek ran with icy water, and the first snowflakes fell one morning as Lily gathered twigs. She laughed at the sight, chasing them as they melted on her mittens, while Michael stood still, heart heavy. Snow was beautiful, yes, but it was also relentless. He knew now that their lives would depend on how well they endured it. The balance between fear and hope shifted again when Lily's health improved. The fever faded, the cough softened, and color returned to her cheeks. She grew lively once more, asking questions about the journal, about the man named T.S., and about whether they would find more of his secrets in the woods. Her curiosity was contagious. Michael began to see the cabin not just as a desperate refuge, but as a place layered with history, a place where another man had once wrestled with the same questions of survival, greed, and purpose. Perhaps they were not alone in their struggle. Perhaps the mountain itself was teaching them. The turning point came on a crisp morning when the first true blanket of snow covered the ridge. Michael and Lily stood on the porch, looking out over a world transformed, white and silent under the pale sun. Lily slipped her hand into his. "It's our home now," she said softly. Michael's throat tightened. He thought of the hunters' laughter, of the fever that had nearly undone them, of the storm that had battered the roof. He thought, too, of the words written decades ago in a trembling hand, warning and guiding at once. He squeezed Lily's hand and whispered back, "Yes, our home." Yet even as he said it, he felt the weight of the next trial pressing near. The journal had hinted at more secrets, and the forest held them in its frozen silence. The struggle for survival had bound him and Lily to the cabin, but the mystery of T.S. pulled them deeper still, toward discoveries that might test not only their endurance, but the very meaning of the life they were fighting to build. The snow lay heavy on the cabin roof by the time Michael finally allowed himself to breathe, without the constant fear that each night might be their last. Winter had closed its grip around the mountains, silencing the forest in a way that was both haunting and strangely comforting. The trees, stripped bare of their leaves, stood like ancient sentinels, and the creek had slowed beneath a layer of brittle ice. Yet inside the cabin, warmth glowed from the stove and from the fire Michael had worked so tirelessly to coax into dependable life. The air smelled of smoke and pine, of dried herbs and the faint sweetness of apples stored in a crate. Martha Blackwell had brought before the last passable roads froze. Each evening, as the wind howled outside, Michael found himself marveling at the transformation. The cabin, once a ruin mocked by strangers, had become a place of safety, a fortress not of stone, but of perseverance. He and Lily had patched the leaks, sealed the windows with plastic sheets, and lined the walls with salvaged cloth and wood for insulation. The sagging porch now stood reinforced, sturdy enough to bear their steps without groaning, and the stack of firewood, though diminished with each passing day, was still tall enough to remind Michael that they had prepared well. The laughter of the hunters who had called it a coffin on stilts seemed a distant echo now, powerless against the living proof of what he and Lily had accomplished. Lily herself was the truest sign of their success. The sickness that had once left her weak and coughing had passed, and though her cheeks remained pale from the cold, her eyes shone with vitality. She had taken to exploring every corner of the cabin as though it were a palace, arranging her few toys on the shelves they had cleared, inventing stories about the man whose initials, T.S. were carved into the windowsill. She spoke of him as though he were an old friend, imagining his voice guiding them through the mountains. Michael would smile at her tales, though deep inside he knew there was truth in them, for Sullivan's journals and hidden notes had indeed guided them, showing the way to survive and even to hope. In the long evenings when Lily lay curled by the fire with her stuffed rabbit, Michael often sat at the table with the journal open before him. He reread the passages about the mountains, the warnings about greed, and the reminders that the land gave but also remembered. The words resonated more deeply with him each time. He had arrived here as a man broken by loss and poverty, a father desperate enough to gamble his last dollars on a shell of a cabin. Now, sitting in the flickering firelight with his daughter safe and warm, he realized he had gained something far greater than money could buy. He had gained belonging, not only to this cabin but to a life that was truly theirs, earned by sweat, tears, and a refusal to surrender. The snow deepened as the weeks passed, and travel became impossible. They were cut off from the town, but Michael found that the isolation no longer terrified him. They had enough supplies, carefully rationed, to see them through. He learned to bake rough bread on the stove, and Lily delighted in helping him mix the flour and water with her small hands. They gathered snow in buckets to melt for water when the creek froze, and though it meant endless trips outside into the biting air, Michael took comfort in the rhythm of it. Each small act of survival stitched itself into the fabric of their days, until the life that had once seemed impossible began to feel almost natural. It was during one of those long winter nights that Lily surprised him with words that struck his heart more deeply than any journal could. They had finished a simple meal and sat wrapped in blankets before the fire when she said quietly, "I don't miss the old house anymore." Michael turned to her, startled. The house she spoke of was the one they had lost, the suburban place filled with broken memories of her mother's laughter and of the debts and arguments that had followed. He opened his mouth to ask her what she meant, but she continued, "This place is better. It's ours. Nobody can take it away." For a long moment, Michael could not reply. Tears burned in his eyes, but he blinked them back and gathered her into his arms. "You're right," he whispered into her hair. "It's ours, and it always will be." The cabin had indeed become something more than a roof over their heads. It was the crucible in which their sorrow and fear had been transformed into resilience and hope. It was the ground where despair had been buried and new life had taken root. The hidden notes of Thomas Sullivan, the journal left behind with its maps and warnings, had given them more than clues to survival. They had given Michael a vision of what it meant to live with respect, to honor the land and the bond between father and daughter. Sullivan had walked away from wealth in order to preserve something greater, and now Michael understood that lesson better than ever. True wealth was not silver in the ground or dollars in a bank, but the warmth of a child's laughter in a cabin built by one's own hands. As the winter deepened, Michael and Lily found small joys in their isolation. They built tiny snowmen outside the cabin door, their faces made from pebbles and their arms from twigs. They read stories aloud by lantern light, Michael's voice carrying through the stillness as Lily listened with rapt attention. They marked the passing days by scratching small lines into the wood beside the fireplace, turning survival into a quiet celebration of time endured. And though storms howled and the night stretched long, there was always the steady glow of firelight, the comfort of shared meals, and the knowledge that they had built a refuge with their own hands. By the time the first signs of spring began to appear, Michael realized how much had changed within him. He no longer thought of himself as a man on the run from failure. He was a father who had faced the wilderness and endured, a man who had created a new life for his daughter from the ruins of the old. The fear that had once clawed at him had been replaced by determination, and the despair that had threatened to break him had given way to pride. On one of the first warm days, when the snow had melted into streams that rushed through the forest, Michael and Lily walked to the ridge together. They stood side by side, looking out over the valley below, where the trees were beginning to show hints of green again. Lily took his hand, her face alight with wonder. "It's so big," she whispered. Michael nodded, his heart swelling. "It is, and it's ours now. All of it, the cabin, the forest, this mountain. It's our home." In that moment, he felt the full truth of what they had achieved. The cabin that had once been mocked as worthless had become their sanctuary, not because it was perfect, but because they had chosen to make it so. The Journal of TS had shown them the dangers of greed and the need for respect, and Michael knew he would honor that lesson for the rest of his life. They would live simply, they would live with care, but most of all, they would live together. As they turned back toward the cabin, the sun glinting through the branches, Michael realized that the story of their lives had shifted. No longer was he a man defined by what he had lost. He was defined by what he had built, by the strength he had found in the face of hardship, by the daughter who walked beside him with unwavering trust. The cabin was no longer just a desperate gamble. It was a symbol of renewal, of the truth that sometimes the smallest seeds of hope could grow into the strongest shelter. That night, as they sat before the fire and listened to the creek roaring with melted snow, Michael opened his worn notebook and wrote a new entry. He recorded the work they had done, the hardships they had overcome, and the lessons he had learned. At the end he wrote, "The cabin is no longer broken, neither are we." Then he closed the book, set it beside Sullivan's journal, and felt a peace deeper than he had ever known. Outside, the mountain watched in silence, its ridges etched against the dark sky. The wind whispered through the pines, carrying with it the memory of all who had come before and the promise of all who would come after. And within the cabin, warmed by fire and by love, Michael and Lily began to dream not of survival, but of the future. Don't forget to subscribe so you never miss our next incredible stories. Click now to watch the next video. It's even more shocking than this one. And if this story kept you hooked, share it with your friends. You won't believe how many people will thank you for it.